Hello, my name is Dr. Frank Romano. I am a member of the French and American bars and a former associate tenured professor from the University of Paris. I want to talk to you today about urgent humanitarian disaster that's happening today before our eyes. Let's keep things in perspective though. Atrocities have been committed on both sides, and when the dust settles, we'll explain those things. We'll talk about that later. But let's look at the roots of the conflict. The Palestinians have been subject to a very vicious, long-term occupation for many years, with the results of having food shortage, shortage of water, unemployment, so forth. We'll get into more detail for years. This has given rise to high poverty and a feeling of hopelessness. And I know that's true because I lived in the West Bank, and I can witness that. Let's keep things in perspective though. On October 7th, 2023 was the Hamas attack that we know about. It came out of intense frustration and a feeling of asphyxiation due to the blockade of Gaza, the controls of getting in and leaving Gaza almost impossible. It's like, as people say, the biggest open-air prison in the world. And the intrusions of settlers into the Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount area in Jerusalem, by Jewish Zionist supremacists that have a desire to transform the Al-Aqsa Mosque later on into a Jewish temple, has also exacerbated the tension and frustration and gave rise to this conflict. Ben-Gvir, for example, from the Jewish Power Supremacist Party, has promoted attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And now he's a member of the Likud, a member of the Netanyahu cabinet. Again, we can say then October 7th recognized that the Palestinians felt very, very confined and asphyxiated due to the blockade. But when you corner someone or an animal into a corner, the frustration, the intensity mounts, and they lash out. You could argue then that Netanyahu welcomed the attack because it could use this as a pretext now to do what he always wanted to do, especially the supremacists and the Zionists wanted to attack Gaza, get rid of Gaza, get rid of all the Palestinians eventually. And Netanyahu, at the same time, is placating his cabinet, the far-right cabinet, to maintain the mandate that he's always trying to seek. So, October 7th attack, you could say, was understandable and predictable. But any atrocities committed before that or after that by Palestinians are not justified, nor are atrocities committed by Israelis, whether they be Zionist or not, especially either side targeting civilians, are not justified. So this cycle of violence that we see feeds the Hamas approach. The Hamas approach to push Israel into the sea. This vicious cycle of violence also feeds the fanatic Zionist, the supremacist approach. Those that want a Jewish state, in particular manifested by the Jewish nation-state law that favors Jews and Judaism over non-Jews, and there's no equal protection in this law that was just adopted, not to mention the law that allows for owners to lease only to Jews in Israel. Clearly discriminatory. This adds to the pressure and to the futilousness of really living in this occupation by the Palestinians. So let's look now at the International Court of Justice. They have failed Palestine. In particular, the International Criminal Court prosecutor, Karim Khan, has done absolutely nothing to prosecute the Israeli criminals for war crimes and their accomplices since he took office. Even though there's absolute evidence of these war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide, nothing has happened on his side. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, therefore has become overly politicized and clearly not impartial, like courts are bound to be, are supposed to be. An example, only after 1 year that Russia attacked the Ukraine, that Putin received an arrest warrant from the ICC. Since 1948, Israeli officials have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity with their accomplices against the Palestinians, and no arrest warrants have been issued. So clearly, the court has been politicized and discriminatory in that regard. Another ignominious example of an international court is the International Court of Justice. It hasn't been much better than the ICC. Both these courts, the ICC and the ICJ, have clearly been very negligent in their duties, in particular toward Palestinians, and adjudicating their cause against Israeli agents. Let's take the recent decision of January 26th of the International Criminal Court. It at least said that it's plausible that the Israelis officials have committed genocide against the Palestinians, and then specified measures that the Israeli military and government must follow to prevent genocide, to prevent incitement of genocide, and to enhance the entry of humanitarian trucks to deliver food, water, and medical supplies. That's been over a month, and that decision was rendered, and Israel has done little to nothing to comply with it. The ruling, however, has value. The ICJ's ruling has value because for once, the charades of immunity around Israel fell to the ground when that decision was rendered, and the United States could not impose its veto with the International Court of Justice, as the United States has done regularly before the UN Security Council, especially when the Council is trying to temper the massacre of Palestinians by Israelis and the land grab by Israelis and Israeli settlers of Palestinian land. So, however, the International Court of Justice decision is very weak and indecisive because it did not order at least a temporary ceasefire. The absolute necessity is obvious. It did not order that ceasefire, and it did not condemn Israel for committing genocide in spite of the clear evidence that genocide has been committed. Let's talk a little bit about Bernie Sanders, who has one of the only American politicians who's not accepting money from the Israeli lobby. However, recently in a speech, he was skittish about verbalizing the word genocide with respect to Israel. For goodness sake, genocide and the apartheid state syndrome of Israel has been a long-term policy of Israel. Sanders, you have the courage and the intelligence to speak the truth. Now, I'd like to emphasize this point of genocide by quoting some of the Israeli officials' genocidal intents that they have not even tried to cover over or tried to make to be secret about. For instance, on October 9th, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, said, "We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly." October 29th, Netanyahu cited Judaic scripture by saying, "You must remember what Amalek did to you in our holy, as it says in our holy Bible. Amalek, it says to now go and smite Amalek, kill both man and woman, infant." And that's the prime minister, Netanyahu, speaking. Another example of this is in November when Yitzhak Koetzer, a member of the Knesset, said There's only one sentence that we can render for the Gazans now, and that is death. And finally, a member of Netanyahu's own cabinet, Mr. Eliyahu, recently said one of the main Israeli options could be to drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza. Well, what about President Biden's approach? Biden has given us very weak and indecisive leadership with respect to the Palestine-Israeli conflict, especially what's happening in Gaza today. In the middle of this massacre, in the middle of this genocide, Biden approves of unbridled sources of money and weapons to go to Israel. It's like giving the state of Israel a green light to continue committing these war crimes. Now, I guarantee that this makes the United States an accomplice to these war crimes. And Mr. Biden has earned his right now to be a defendant. I'm going to add him to the complaint before the ICC that I filed a couple of years ago that includes Netanyahu and his other thug cohorts. Now, let's look at Biden's approval of the endless arms and weapons going to Israel. They're vaguely, his giving the weapons and releasing all the funds to Israel is conditioned on a kind of a weak condition that Israel must be careful with civilian losses, not bomb the civilians, for instance. This is equivalent to a World War II fiasco when British Prime Minister Chamberlain went and tried to negotiate with Hitler by giving him the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia on the condition that Hitler will not take any more European land. Hitler scoffed at that, and right after that took the rest of Czechoslovakia and then invaded Poland and then took a big chunk of Europe after that. Israeli leaders, like Hitler, scoffing at Chamberlain's, Israeli leaders scoffed at Biden's attempts at appeasement, of course. His weak conditions and his whimpering of a possible ceasefire, Biden's whimpering of a be careful with civilians, and the Israeli leaders grabbed the money and the arms and then have continued and continue today, as I'm talking, to massacre innocent children and women, Gazans in general, in Gaza and in the West Bank with those arms. President Biden needs to use his leverage to say, and he's got the power to do it, no more arms, no more money to Israel unless a ceasefire is set, a durable ceasefire, a long-term ceasefire is set, and unless humanitarian aid is freely allowed to enter. As we said before, the Israeli soldiers are blocking, as well as Zionists at the border, hundreds of trucks full of food and water that could save the Gazans from starvation. He could use this leverage. And also to request a final withdrawal from Gaza. And unless Biden gets all these things, no more money and weapons. This should be the leverage that the U.S. should use, and I might add, force is the only language that Israel can ever understand anyway. But Biden has been bought, like many U.S. politicians and some European politicians, bribed, you could say, by many Zionist donors to continue supporting Israel and not criticizing Israel on the condition he gets money to help him with the elections. But what he does, he weighs his priority of being elected with Zionist money, let's put this on the right hand here, far outweighs consequences to the thousands of innocent people dying in Gaza. The results are ignominious. Biden knows what the right thing to do is to save the Palestinians from this carnage that the United States is helping with its arms and money and promoting Israel in this effort to annihilate the Gazans and the Palestinians in general from both Gaza and the West Bank. But he needs courage and confidence without the millions from the Zionist sources to be elected by coercing Israel to do the right thing, to do what we talked about before, coercing Israel to stop the massacre, stop the genocide. But like other politicians, Biden has succumbed to temptations for more money, for more power, nourished by his greed at the expense of thousands of innocent people. Let's change the focus now to the February 29th massacre, recent massacre. And I made a mistake in the first video. I said it was March 20th, February 29th. This massacre of starving Palestinians, starving Gazans took place a day after Karl Skau of the World Food Program said that 500,000 Gazans, that's to say 1 in 4, are subject to famine, starving now, and 1 of 6 children are already clearly seriously malnourished. I might add that after October 7th, well, before October 7th, there have been 500 trucks arriving in Gaza with food, water, and medical supplies, and now less than 90 arrive per day, far less than what's needed to keep these people alive. Let's return now to the specifics of this massacre. On the street Haram al-Rashid in Gaza, people were waiting for the trucks to arrive with flour. And according to Al Jazeera's Huni Mahmoud, they started pulling flour from the trucks when the Israeli soldiers started to fire on them. The Israeli military officer said, well, a stampede happened and people were trampled under the force of the crowd. And then he started moving toward the soldiers who fired only warning shots. This I contest. This is a bold-faced lie. Dr. Salha, the head of Al-Hawda Hospital, said after that incident, 80% of those coming to the hospital that were wounded, and this doesn't include over 100 who were killed, 80% wounded people were wounded by gunshots, and the rest had injuries that looked like that they got them from the stampede. The truth is, Al Jazeera's Ismail Gul said, Israel's tanks advanced after they had shot many Gazans and ran over many dead and injured people. Then Al Jazeera's Bernard Smith added that the Israeli military, as we said before, tried to blame the crowd, that it was a stampede, and then they felt threatened. Then the soldiers felt threatened because the crowd apparently was moving toward the tanks. I'd like to ask you, what type of threat could that be for a crowd of hungry people threatening, quotes unquotes, tanks and armed Israeli soldiers? Now Mohammed Ahmed from on Forum Sky News said, at the end of the day, unfortunately, there's a moment that would have given some relief and happiness to hundreds of people turned into a bloodbath. And OHCHR, a UN office, said that from the middle of January to the end of February, there had been 14 separate incidences of Israeli soldiers shooting on Palestinians seeking supplies from trucks, seeking to feed themselves and to hydrate themselves. Now, let's take a little step back here and take a look at the crowd. The crowd's desperate, starving and dehydrated. Even if the crowd were to have surrounded a tank, not even thinking about their own security. What, again, threat could these people have to make against the Israeli soldiers? Let's take another step back. Let's look at the origins of the entire conflict, the Palestine-Israeli conflict. Especially what's happening today, people point a finger at Hamas again. It's Hamas's efforts, their attack has led to the deaths, the injuries, the starvation, etc. I entreat you, let us not forget the origins of all the starvation and the unemployment. The die was cast long before October 7th. The Israeli occupation, the blockade of Gaza, the attacks of settlers, etc., is the true, or they are the true origins, especially after the 1967 war. Okay, we talk about the settler violence. It's given rise to high unemployment, scarce food, scarce water, scarce opportunities, limited mobility, limited freedom, and an intense feeling, which I could witness as I lived in the West Bank, hopelessness, complete hopelessness, that there's no real future for the Palestinians under this terrible occupation. So, try to look at Hamas's point of view. They feel justified in eliminating and pushing Israel into the sea. Why? For attacking Palestinians, to avenge Palestinians. At least someone is avenging the Palestinians, whereas Abu Mazen, the Palestinian Authority, is doing more collaborating with its enemies than really fighting for Palestinians. So Hamas has taken a stand for desperate people, again, pushed into a corner. The fanatic Zionists, the supremacists, who started this whole thing, they attack after a Palestinian attack, using the propaganda and saying this is only in self-defense, even though they started it. And the supremacists, the staunch Zionists that we see are taking over more and more in Netanyahu's government, try to use that as a pretext to push all non-Jews, especially Palestinians, out of the Holy Land. So, what's the solution? Finally, what is the solution? We need to set up together an independent Palestinian state to exist alongside an independent Israeli state. When that's accomplished, the Hamas approach would be far less appealing, and very few people will support Hamas. Why? Because Hamas's call to fight the occupation, the blockade, the settler attacks, the attacks on Alaska would be nonsense, because they will not exist. Palestine will have its state. And we envisaged the capital being East Jerusalem. On the other side, no attacks by the Palestinians, the fanatic Zionists, especially the supremacists as well, their call to attack would be equally, and their propaganda saying that we're doing this in self-defense would be nonsense. Because the Palestinians we can focus on their own state, focusing on surviving in their own state and not attacking and not worried about Israelis taking their land and attacking them, as what's happening today in the West Bank and of course in Gaza. So finally, all we need now is a sincere desire to work together to make this happen so we can live in peace and harmony. Thank you.